3 years ago, I was banished by my own pack because I had a unique healing power that they couldn't accept. They called me a freak, a disgrace. I was forced to wander alone in the wild. But fate played a huge joke on me. At my most desperate moment I met my destined mate, who publicly rejected me and drove me out of the pack. Let's officially listen to today's werewolf story. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for your support. Prologue. 3 years ago. Crimson Crescent Pack lands. Serena peeked at the street from behind a wall in a dirty alley. Raindrops were dripping from the front of her hood continuously. Her body was shaking from the cold. Her clothes were too thin for the late autumn weather, and the damp cloth had clung to her skinny body like a second skin. Glancing a few times around the street to make sure the coast was clear, she came out of the shadows of the alley and began to quick walk toward the direction that led her out of the village. Her heart, which would usually pound so fast in situations like that, was less frantic that day, and she felt more courageous. All because last night something special had happened to her. She had finally shifted. The event was both painful and joyous for her. She was not alone anymore. After 3 years, she had felt happy and strong for the first time. Her wolf was ordinary, but she meant the world to her. She had seen herself in a pond. Her wolf was grey with white patches on her forehead and paws. It was beautiful, and the aurora that had engulfed her from last night had managed to fill the empty abyss that had formed in her heart for years. Having her wolf also meant she would no longer stay starved for days, for she could go hunting like other wolves. It also meant she could finally leave the packlands and flee from the hellish life she had gone through since the beginning because of foolish and judgmental people. Being a werewolf with magical powers was not acceptable to the Crimson Crescent pack members. She was the freak, the outcast, someone who was only tolerated in the pack because of her grandfather, who was from high-ranking wolves. Everyone believed her grandfather had bewitched her grandfather into believing that he was her mate. But her grandmother would always tell her that they were real mates and had fallen in love immediately, and Serena believed her over all of those wretched people of the pack. For their power was nothing other than healing powers. But the pack members never believed them just because they were different than them, just because they were more special. The Alpha and Luna did nothing to stop their torment but made it even worse, deeming them even lesser than an Omega and a shame to the pack. Her grandmother was the one who had raised her and the only person who had ever loved her. Her parents and grandfather were victims of a rouge attack when she was only a few months old, leaving the two alone in the cruel world. After their death, the pack had put her grandmother under even more pressure. But despite the pain of losing her mate, her daughter, and her son-in-law, her grandmother had raised her to be a kind and wise girl, teaching her everything she knew about their powers. But Serena's only light in life had been taken from her brutally and based on a wrong accusation when she was 16, leaving her alone in a life full of pain and misery. So you can imagine her joy after shifting to her wolf 2 years later on her 18th birthday right at midnight. She could now use her full healing powers, and she wasn't feeling so weak anymore. Hope for a better life had blossomed in her heart, and she felt like nothing could stop her anymore. Putting her head down even more, she made sure to stay in the shadows as she walked as fast as she could without bringing too much attention to herself. The street was muddy and her flat shoes were completely damp and dirty, making her feel even colder. But it was not going to dampen her good mood on her birthday. Despite the pack members' hatred for her, they still couldn't deny her ability to create remedies and potions, and they would discreetly seek her help from time to time. Just like that day, she had gone to the house of the family to give them a remedy for the cold for their 2-year-old baby who was on the brink of death. She couldn't resist herself in not using her powers to heal the small baby. The mother who had called her without husband's knowing had cried, thanking her so many times for saving her baby, and had paid her double to show her gratitude. So Serena had taken it as another good sign. A sign that her life had finally turned better, and it was going to become better day by day from her birthday. She was going to go to a bakery and buy herself a chocolate cake to celebrate her birthday. But fate was not sitting idly by that day. Just as she was a few meters from the bakery, suddenly a divine scent hit her nostrils. The scent was faint and almost non-existent due to the pouring that for a second she thought she imagined it. But a wolf suddenly perked up and began growling and pacing in her mind. urging her to follow the scent. Not being able to control herself and despite the warning bells and fear in her mind, she began to follow the scent, sniffing in every direction to find the source. As the scent grew stronger and stronger, her heart began to pound even harder, ready to jump out of her rib cage. Each step of hers took her closer to the center of the town, and her dread increased. She knew she would be in trouble if one of the pack members would cast their attention on her and would decide to hurt her. But the scent had awakened such a feeling in her that she couldn't stop herself from pursuing it, and she knew what that meant. Her grandmother had told her what it was. The mate pull, it meant her mate was close. Her nerves were on fire and she was feeling nausea. She was so lucky to find her mate on her 18th birthday. She knew her mate would love her no matter what. They were chosen by the moon goddess, after all, to love and cherish each other. Nothing in this world could stop her mate from wanting to love her. Not even her powers or the pack members' hate. Just like her father had loved her mother and her grandfather had loved her grandmother. Only if she knew how wrong she was. Turning in a corner, she heard a commotion and a loud growl before she came to stop just to meet us from a group of werewolves, and her heart stopped beating as the severity of the situation came down on her. Right in front of them stood the group of boys, all from the most high-ranking families in the pack, and in front of all of them, with his eyes glowing like a pot of silver, feral and frantic, was the alpha's son. To my agent extraordinaire, Lament, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And his eyes were fixed on his mate. If the growl that left his lips was not enough to make her jump startled, the thunder that chose right then to roar did the job. Her legs began to shake and she took a step back because the look on her mate's face was anything but loving. He looked so angry that his body was shaking hard, and his fists were clenching and unclenching. His messy, wet black hair had fallen on his forehead, casting shadows on his blazing eyes. He looked on the verge of shifting. His canines had elongated and his claws were drawn, tearing the flesh of his palms. Obviously, his wolf was trying to take control and make him claim her right then and there, but he was doing a great job at controlling himself, just like a true alpha. At the age of 19, he was the strongest male in the pack, even stronger than his father, the current alpha. His body was made of pure muscles and he was taller than even his future beta. Tears began to fall from her eyes as her lips quivered. Surely that was a mistake. A cruel mistake. Surely Moon Gods was not that heartless to take her last ray of hope for having a beautiful future. Surely she had not accidentally mated her with one of her main tormentors. She is your mate. Her head snapped to the person on his right and her insides lurched at the sight of the bulky figure of the future beta and Ajax's best friend. Her nightmare. For some reason. To my agent extraordinaire, Lament, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The future beta hated and her family the most. The disdain in his tone was not discreet at all, although laced with shock and surprise. Her tearful eyes darted on each face in the group. She didn't know many of them, but the beta's twin, Damien, was there as well. He had never directly tormented her, urged her, or even talked with her, but his indifference and emotionless glances when the others would hurt her worse than committing the crime itself. He had never tried to help her, and that was enough to put him on her bad list. But at that moment, she could swear she saw a glimpse of worry in his eyes that were darting between her and Ajax. No fucking way. Her eyes once again darted back to her mate to force the 3 words out through his gritted teeth, destroying the little hope she had that maybe the mate pull cause him to change his mind about her and at least give her a chance to get to know her. Please. The word left her mouth in a soft plea as tears finally ran down her face. She hugged herself as cold suddenly hit her hard and her wolf howled in pain. She jumped out of her shoes and let out a squeak as Ajax let out a roar and punched the wooden pillar beside him, breaking the thick pillar as if it were a stick. At that point, silent sobs were shaking her body hard. She knew she had to flee before things turned worse, but she was glued to the spot, praying that maybe his wolf would change his mind. His eyes turned to her once again, their color changing between his brown ones and his wolf's silver ones, meaning he was in constant fight to keep his wolf in check. A crowd had gathered around them and whispers could be heard. Is this a fucking joke? He let out a laugh so cold and bitter that sent shivers down her body. No fucking way I accept a lowlife like you as my mate. No fucking way. She flinched as he shouted the hurtful words. Her heart shattered and her wolf let out a whimper of pain, curling in herself in her mind. Look at me. Taking a step toward her. Jumping again, she took a step back and looked up at him. Please. She sobbed softly. She was sure who she was pleading with at that moment. Maybe to Moon Goddess to suddenly appear and tell them it was a joke and another werewolf was her mate who she didn't hate. But even if she hated the boy in front of her, the maple was at work and she couldn't feel the hate that much. Her pleading eyes darted from him to the people behind him. But her heart shattered even more and more tears ran down her face when she saw every earnest look of utter disgust and disdain or indifference fixed on her. I said, look at me. Her frantic eyes snapped up back to him and she braced herself for what she knew was coming. Please. Still the plea left her lips as she locked eyes with her furious mate, trying to somehow convince him to give her a chance. Ajax, son of Alexander, the future alpha of the Crimson Crescent Pack. Reject you low life she, wolf as my mate and my future Luna. Her hand went to her heart and she hunched over as pain suddenly burst from her heart. She bit her bottom lip so hard to stop her cry that blood filled her mouth. He hadn't even bothered himself to ask her name to reject her property. Lightning flashed, so bright and flashed so loud that people covered their ears and rain poured harder. Enthusiasm. Ajax was panting himself. If he was in pain like her, he was not showing anything in his face. He took a step toward her and stood tall of her as she sank to her knees on the muddy ground, clutching her shirt over her heart. And I had enough of your bullshit. Rain dropping from his hair, his eyes changing color rapidly, and his voice so rough and husky and animal-like. As the future alpha, hereby I banish you from the pack forever. She squinted her eyes tightly as pain only intensified as the weak connection she had with her pack snapped and destroyed. Thunder roared so loud that windows rattled on the verge of breaking. He bent down, his face close to her hunched over body as he whispered words that burnt her soul to ashes. Get lost before I throw you in the basement and torture you for the rest of your pathetic life. And she did. Shifting to her grey wolf on the spot, she ran and ran and ran, cowling her pain on her way. She had passed the pack border hours ago and her pain had dulled up a bit. But she didn't stop. She didn't stop until it happened. She suddenly felt such an agonizing hot pain in her heart that knocked the breath out of her already burning lungs. Her wolf hit the ground hard and everything went black. Chapter 1. The past at her doorstep. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylin Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. We should find a shelter. Grayson won't last longer if we continue in this storm. Ajax heard Dame In's concerned voice through their mind link as they continued to run in their wolf form through the forest. Their pause was soundless on the deep snow. The only sound was howling of the wind and groans of pain coming from Grayson strapped on Damien's back. A strange snowstorm was raging that night and even the large trees of the forest couldn't shelter them from the slaps of the wind and ice. Sniffing the air, Ajax growled in satisfaction when he couldn't smell the scent of the hunters or rougers anymore. We have lost them for some time. We can find shelter. Keep your eyes open for any places. He mind-linked others. I can see a light ahead. Toby's voice ran through their minds and every owner's ears perked up as they looked ahead with hope. Wolves are strong creatures who are so immune in front of cold to a high extent. But even strong and big wolves like them could be worn out after a hard fight with hunters and rougers and running in a storm for 2 hours. They all came to a halt when they saw a cottage in a clearing in the forest. Light was seeping through the curtains and smoke was coming from the chimney on the roof. Should we go in? They can be any creature. Or our enemy, asked Tarek, one of the warriors, as he tilted his head to the alpha. We should be close to the vampire coven. It can be a vampire's house, said Nick the Gamma. Eric let out a threatening growl and the others went rigid at the mention of the leeches. That can also be the indication that it can be safe, answered Ajax. It can be a human living here. The vampire king protects the surroundings of his coven as well. Vampires only live in their coven, not separately. For some odd reason, He was feeling a pull toward the small cottage. His wolf had become even more agitated as he stared at the house, but the sort of agitation that was urging him to leap forward and barge into the house. So we go ask for help. Ask Damien urgently. His tone was laced with utter worry as Grayson let out another grunt of pain. Looking at his unconscious naked beta strapped on Damien's back, Ajax caved into his urge and nodded his wolfish head. We go in. Shift back to your human form. We don't want to scare the people in the house if they are human. The sound of cracking bones was quickly swallowed by the sound of the wind, and soon 6 tall and muscular men were walking toward the house, carrying a large man with themselves. Unknown to Ajax, he was not the only one who was feeling oddly safe to approach the house. All of the men were feeling somehow eager as they went closer to the cottage. It was as if a welcoming aura was coming from the house, inviting the always suspicious men to relax for once. "Goddess, I wish we had clothes so we didn't have to face them naked," mumbled Toby as they walked toward the front door of the house. "A bit sheltered from the wind now. We have no other choice." "Come on." Enthusiasm, Ajax growled lowly, frowning, not understanding his wolf's eagerness. He and Damien, who were carrying Grayson's heavy form, were first to reach the door. A faint pleasing scent hit his nostrils and he unconsciously took a large gulp of the air, wanting to taste the sweet scent on his tongue. He raised his fist and pounded on the door a few times. He was on edge, and it was not because Grayson's groaning and grunting had increased to an alarming rate, but because his wolf was going nuts in his mind. Yet came that howling in his mind, and he got to know why when the door was suddenly yanked open a few seconds later and a wave of rose scent mixed with lavender and some herbs hit him hard and almost brought him to his knees. His wolf let out a loud howl out of utter joy when an angelic voice cried out a name. "James." Ajax felt his whole body stoned at the sight in front of him. His eyes bulged out of their sockets as he took the petite woman in front of him. The light was coming from behind her, but the sharp eyes could easily see her angelic, beautiful, and delicate facial features. She was wearing a long white cotton dress and a cream-colored shawl was wrapped around her shoulders. Her long dark brown hair had been pulled into a braid that had fallen over her shoulder with a few strands framing her porcelain face. She clamped her mouth shut quickly at the sight of them. Her face paled visibly and her beautiful green doe eyes widened from shock. And they were fixed on Ajax, her mate. She was not what he expected at all, not even close to his imagination. She had changed so much. She had turned from being a scrawny teenager who was literally skin and bone to a beautiful woman. Her face and body had gained some meat and she was radiating beauty and elegance. He had thought his rejection must have killed her. If not his rejection, then her living as a rouge should have done the job. And that thought had deprived him of sleep so many nights in the past 3 years. But his assumptions and thoughts were defiantly wrong, for there she was, so radiant and beautiful, standing in front of him, more livelier than any time he had seen her before. And the thought sent a pang of pain to his heart. She was so better without him around her and after his rejection. Damien's low mumble brought him out of his trance. Both of the men's eyes snapped down when they heard a small yipping sound and were surprised to see a small white and fluffy puppy the size of their palms peeking from behind her skirt, trying to sound intimating. That's when Ajax saw a glint of silver in his mate's hand, and when he looked better, he saw a knife in a trembling hand, so small that it looked more like a butter knife than a blade that could hurt someone. "Please let us in. We mean no harm," Toby shouted from behind the wall that Damien and Ajax had created, peeking from behind Grayson's hunched and limp body to see whoever was at the door. His mate's eyes suddenly snapped at Grayson after he let out another groan of pain, and she gasped. "Oh my God." Her honey-like voice sounded again, which made Ajax almost groan. She quickly went out of the way and opened the door wider. "Bring him in, quickly," she ordered, and Ajax watched a blush adoring her cheeks as she tried to keep her head up to only see their upper bodies and not the jewels dangling in front of them. He growled lowly as he felt a surge of possessiveness in his body. Nudity was not unusual among werewolves, but he didn't like his mate to see a bunch of naked guys. Not at all. His wolf was growing dangerously in his mind, especially when he smelled the scent of a male werewolf in the cottage mixed with hers. He was going nuts. Inside it was a cozy and warm atmosphere, The furniture was simple and might look cheap, but they were clean and well kept. A small open kitchen was on one side with a door beside it. The kitchen had only 2 cabinets on one side, an oven with another cabinet on the wall beside it, and a table 4 in the middle. On the other side of the kitchen was a living room with a fireplace where a couch and 2 sofas with a small table in between were placed. All around the living room pots of plants were placed. 2 doors leading to bedrooms were opening to the living room. A bookshelf was on one side and it was full of books from floor to ceiling. Agax's eyes followed his mate, who quickly got rid of her shawl, leaving her only in her white dress that in his opinion was showing too much of her chest skin, although no cleavage was shown thanks to her medium to small breasts. "Take him to the room on the right," she told them, quickly walking to the fireplace where a kettle was whistling on the fire. "Cookie, honey, go and stay in your bed," she said to the fluff ball that was jumping behind her and barking. The small dog obediently ran to a makeshift bed in a corner of the living room and lay there, looking at the big werewolves with worry. Ajax and Damien took Grace into the mentioned room that smelled strongly of her, and based on the womanly vibes of it, it had to be hers. There was a bed on the wall opposite from a window with green curtains. There was a desk under the window that had books, notes and some of the healer stuff. A drawer with a small mirror on top and a cabinet beside it was the other furniture of the small room, beside a few other pots with lively plants in them. There was a small space left in the middle that almost seemed non-existent with the presence of the 2 bulky men. At least she had her own room and bed and was not sharing it with the man. The thought already put Ajax at ease, although he didn't know where that sudden posse's Ivness had suddenly come from. "Put him on the bed," ordered Serena, entering the room with the steaming kettle in her hand, completely serious and in her healer mood. She was shocked to her core and her body was still trembling slightly. Who would have thought that she would see her mate once again? But there was a man's life at hand and she had to help him, even if he was her nightmare. What has happened to him? Pouring the hot water inside of a bowl that was on top of her desk beside a pitcher. "He was shot by hunters," answered Damien, grunting a bit under the weight of his brother as they laid him down on the bed. He had removed the arrow himself and the wound is healed, but he collapsed after a minute. Mixing the hot water with the water from the pitcher, she grabbed the bowl and a cloth, rushed to the bed, and knelt beside it. "He is poisoned," she mumbled, examining Grace and Ness vitals. Her frown deepened. "But what kind? The signs he is showing are not for any poison, I know." All the while Ajax stood a step behind her and just watched her serious side profile. Even in his wildest dreams, he wasn't imagining seeing her ever again, and the part of him that felt remorseful for rejecting her, the part that he had buried deep inside of him, was once again fluttering happily. "Then heal him," demanded Damien with a hard tone, his eyes narrowing on her. "You have healing powers, don't you? So you can heal him." The other four had gathered in front of the doorframe and were watching inside of the room with worry etched on their faces for their beta's well-being. Hope listed in their eyes as they looked at Serena's face. Glancing briefly in Damien's direction, her face became colder before she looked at her patient again, putting the damp cloth on his forehead. "I don't have any powers anymore," she answered, her tone hard and emotional as, "Are you kidding me?" growled Damien, his hands balling into fists. "All of us know about your powers." "I don't have any, wolf," she answered, her tone even colder but still patient, as if she was explaining something to a whiny kid. "No, wolf means I have no powers." She quickly stood up and walked to a cabinet in her room and pulled out a few pouches and small bags from it. Pulling out some herbs from pouches, she began crushing them in a small mortar. Growling, Damien quickly grabbed her arm and stopped her. "What the fuck are you talking about?" he asked now angrily, glaring at her hard. "We all saw you shifting into your wolf that day, Damien," Ajax said warningly and stepped forward. A sudden urge bloomed inside of him to protect his mate. Suddenly he hated the fact that someone was manhandling her. But before Ajax can do anything, Serena herself snapped. "Can you feel any wolf in me?" she snapped, looking between the 6 giant men. "You are werewolves. You can feel other people's wolves. Can you feel any in me? And all of them frowned when they cowered. She even smelled like a human, turning and continuing to crush the herbs. Her cheeks heat up once again. And please put some clothes on. If you don't have any, you can find some men's clothing in the next room, she said in a low voice, but everyone heard due to their advanced hearing. The four in front of the room quickly scrambled to the next door obediently, wanting to cover themselves in front of the woman. Now they all knew she was their rejected Luna, and that was why they were feeling that welcoming her a while walk into the cottage. And they wanted nothing more than to cover themselves in front of her to save them from embarrassment and the harsh glares of their alpha. I can't remember any poison that causes the signs like this. It should be new. Serena mumbled to herself as she added some of the herbs inside a mug, poured some water on top of it, and let it brew, taking the rest of the crushed herbs. She turned to walk toward the bed, but stopped dead when Grayson suddenly let out a sound like a strangled whistle, as if his lungs were collapsing in themselves, and his body began to convulse badly. Falling to the floor, Amy and tried to keep Grayson's body on the bed. He glanced at Serena with fright in his eyes. "What's happening to him?" he yelled. Serena was kneeling beside him in a heartbeat and watched as Grayson's face and his veins became even darker than before and popped more out of his skin. Her eyes widened in shock before she jumped to her feet, grabbed her small blade from her desk, and ran back beside Grayson. She grabbed his elbow in a tight grip and was about to run the blade inside of his elbow when two strong hands grabbed her and pulled her to her feet. "What the fuck are you doing?" shouted Damien, the rage inside of his eyes blazing. "Are you trying to kill him? Were you going to open his flesh?" asked Ajax, narrowing his eyes at Serena. He would bleed out. Before Serena could answer, Damien grabbed her throat and pulled her up until she was standing on her tiptoes, struggling to breathe. The blade fell to the ground and her hands clawed at his rough hand in vain to free herself. Damien's eyes flashed golden. His fear for his twin's life stopped all of his rational thoughts. "Were you trying to get your revenge?" he growled through gritted teeth. Everyone else was once again gathered in front of the room and were watching the scene with wide eyes, frozen and not knowing what to do. Damien let her go, growled Ajax, his eyes turning silver as his wolf peeked out angrily. His hand wrapped around Damien's, but he was unable to pry his firm grip without damaging his mate more, who was turning blue. "In your only chance to save your brother." Serena managed to wheeze out her words as black dots began to dance in her vision. Her lungs were burning for an ounce of oxygen. "Damien, let her go, let her go," roared Ajax, pouring his alpha tone into his command. In an instant, Damien's eyes turned to their normal hazel ones, and he let go of Serena as if he was burned by fire. Serena fell on the ground in a heap and began to cough hard, trying to gain her breath again. But one other strangled moan from Grayson was enough for her to grab her blade again, scramble to her feet, and before anyone could react, she sliced the inside of his elbow. Ajax quickly held Damien but tried to run to his twin, shouting profanities. But the curse words died in his throat as everyone watched with wide eyes as black blood as thick as cream slowly seeped out of Grayson's new wound. Still coughing, Serena used her hands and massaged the top of the wound and helped more of the black blood until she saw a bit of normal red blood. She quickly put a cloth on the wound and pressed hard. The only sound that could be heard in the room was the heavy breathing of the 6 men and Grayson's moans of pain that had turned from wheezing to his previous state. His chest was rising and falling rapidly, but his veins turned fader and less visible and his body slumped against the mattress once again. Turning to Ajax, Serena spoke with a hoarse voice. "Press on the wound, please," shoving a frozen Damien aside. Ajax quickly sat beside her and placed his hands on top of hers, ready to replace hers. But just as his skin touched hers, he felt strong electric shocks racking his body hard and fireworks blasted in his mind and stomach, knocking the breath out of his lungs for a second. His face whipped to see her reaction, but to his surprise, she didn't seem fazed at all. Her serious eyes were fixed on Grayson as she cautiously pulled her hands away from the wound, letting Ajax take her place. She hadn't felt the mate sparks. She quickly snatched the mug from the desk and sat on the bed, next to Grayson's head, Ajax helped her pull his head up and fed him the brew slowly. His wolf would heal the wound quickly. She explained in a quiet voice that was still raspy to no one in particular while feeding Grayson carefully. I'm sure we should do what I did a moment ago a few more times or else he will die. That's the only way to clear his blood. At the end of a sentence she began to cough slightly, her throat as dry as a desert. Ajax stretched his arm and quickly grabbed a glass of water from the desk and offered it to her. Mumbling a thank you, she grabbed the glass with her hands that were covered in black blood and gulped down the cool liquid. Her throat eased instantly, but each gulp caused pain to shoot up her neck and her eyes squeezed in pain. Ajax glared at Damien with eyes that promised death, making Damien gulp guiltily and back away slightly. Putting the mug aside, she wiped the sweat from Grayson's face and upper body. She pulled his hair away from his forehead and leaned her body down to him, making Ajax almost let out a possessive growl. Don't you dare to die, she whispered near Grayson's ear. But being werewolves, everyone heard her words crystal clear. You have a mate. You are bearing her mark. Don't you are to die and leave her here alone. Do you even know what a hard life she should go through if you die? She will perish. She will fade away slowly and painfully. If you don't want that for your mate, fight with all of your might. I will help you to heal. Chapter 2. An angel. Ajax watched his mate coming out of the room at dawn. The fire in the fireplace had dimmed, casting shadows everywhere. In the early hours of the morning when the storm had calmed down, Eric and Sam, his 2 warriors, volunteered to run to the pack and inform his Delta. And Macy, Grayson's mate, about the misfortunate event and bring help. Others stayed with him to protect Grayson if hunters had decided to reappear. They had gone to Alpha King's pack to participate in a meeting about increasing attacks of the Rouges with other Alphas and the king himself. They were supposed to return soon after the meeting, for he was forced to take his debaters and his gamma with himself, leaving his pack a bit vulnerable if the Rouges decided to have one of their organized attacks. The attacks had started a year ago. Being one of the biggest and strongest packs, they were able to defeat them with fewer casualties. But as days passed, the attacks increased in number, and not only on them, but at other packs too. What was strange was how organized and well thought out the attacks were, and that created the suspicion of someone being behind them. Because Rouges were idiot and savage creatures, so they weren't able to perform a plan like that. Someone must have been behind them who was powerful enough to unite that great number of the Rouges, and that had caused the Alpha King to hold that meeting. After the meeting and discussing needed things, they had left the King's pack for an hour and were going toward their pack when the hunters attacked them out of nowhere. It was not only them though. A group of Rouges were with them as well, and that was when Grayson had been shot during the fight and they were forced to retreat after killing all of the Rouges. They had managed to run away from the hunters who were great at hiding, but they had managed to lose them through the forest and storm, and they had stumbled upon his mate's house. And fuck him if Fate or Moon Goddess didn't have a hand in it. He watched her from his place on the sofa as she stumbled out of her room. Her once white dress was not full of black blood stains. Her face looked so tired with dark bags that had formed under her eyes. Her braid had become messy and so many strands of hair had stuck out of it. A bruise in the shape of a handprint had formed on her neck, causing him to clench his fists in order to control his rage and his wolf from tearing Damien's hand from his body for hurting her. She seemed dizzy. She leaned on the doorframe, hung her head a bit and massaged her forehead using her hand. All of his muscles were stiff, ready to jump to his feet and run to his mate as she began to fall. It was dawn. She had a rough night taking care of his beta. Grayson had many more of his episodes over the long hours of the night, but it seemed he had calmed down since his last seizure, and based on Damien's report, less amount of black blood had left him and it seemed less thick than before, and his mate had deemed it a good sign. Shaking her head a bit, Zarina walked toward the kitchen. Now that Beta Grayson was in better condition, she could leave his side for some minutes, trusting his brother now, knowing the drill of what to do. She still didn't know the poison or its antidote, so she had settled to clear his body from poison by letting the black blood come out of him and help his body by forcing him to drink lots of water and different herbal brews she knew. She was exhausted, not only from long hours of taking care of her patient, She was used to it, for she was a healer. But mix it with the shock of seeing his mate and packmates plus being almost suffocated by a giant man. It had caused her to become so tired. She was preparing to go to bed last night when they had pounded at her door. Feeling slightly scared about who could have been at her door and a bit excited to think maybe it was James. She had rushed to open the door but had found her worst enemies who had made her life a living hell for 18 years. Walking toward the kitchen, she went to the cabinet beside the stove and pulled out her heart potions vial from it. Drinking a gulp of the pink liquid that tasted like strawberries, she let out a sigh of relief when the potion affected her immediately after touching her taste buds, calming her aching heart and relaxing her body a bit. She looked at the vial in her hand and her brows furrowed with worry. The small vial had less than half liquid in. That was the reason James had left for some days. She was running out of her potion and James had gone to get more of that from a mage they knew. She sighed deeply and glanced outside of the window. The storm had calmed down and now large snowflakes were coming down slowly. It was so strange that such a storm had happened at the start of the spring. A bit of light was coming through the window. It was not time to think about James. He still had 3 more days to return based on what he had promised her. Sighing, she looked down at her nightgown and made a disgusted face. It had lots of black and red blood stains on it. She was sure she had blood on her face and hands too. She needed to change and clean herself before feeding the chickens and starting breakfast. She also needed to apply some ointment on her throbbing neck. She still had difficulty talking. Light snores were coming from the living room. She glanced there briefly and instantly locked eyes with Alpha's dark eyes that were already staring right at her. He was wearing one of James' trousers and a loose shirt. His dark hair had messily fallen on his forehead, covering his shining and intense eyes a bit. His sharp jawline was covered with stubble, making him look even more handsome than ever. Yet, she felt nothing other than a bit of fear and anxiety, and she was glad. She didn't like the man at all, and the last thing she needed was a maple to affect her when they were already done. She was happy that she wouldn't feel miserable again. Still, she cowled and helped to steal a glance at where his mate's mark should have been on his skin. The skin was still clear, meaning he was not mated yet, which was odd considering what had happened to her. Yet, that revelation had made her feel oddly satisfied. She looked down and smiled softly when she felt a tug at her dress. Bending down, she grabbed Puppy from the ground and kissed on her little fluffy head. "Good morning, Puppy," she whispered while putting a finger on her lips. "You should be very quiet. We have a patient that needs to rest." Puppy yipped happily and licked Serena's nose. Serena giggled slightly and rewarded Puppy with a scratch behind her ears. Undusty as an Ajax watched the scene with intense eyes. His wolf was watching eagerly and he knew the fucker's tongue was hanging out of his mouth like a whipped dog. Even he felt his face softening as he watched the adorable scene. Adorable. That word was definitely new in his vocabulary. His eyes followed her as she walked inside her room and a moment later came back with another dress in her hand. Walking to the other room and closing the door behind her, she emerged a few minutes later, now out of her white nightdress and wearing a dark green dress that seemed thicker and better for winter weather but still looked great on her. She had a blanket in her hand. Walking toward the couch where Toby was sleeping, she stopped and gently spread the blanket on top of him. She froze when Toby mumbled something incoherent under his breath but sighed in relief when he snuggled the blanket and began to snore again. An Ajax and Nick's breath caught in their throats at seeing the sight of a small and gentle smile blooming on her lips, putting her long hair into a neat bun. She walked to the kitchen again with her puppy running after her. She silently worked around the kitchen, trying to not disturb Toby. She put a few pieces of wood inside the stove and lit it up, putting a big pot on the stove. She poured water inside of it. Ajax and Nick watched as she silently grabbed a basket and walked toward the front door, picking a cloak from the rack beside the door. She wrapped it around herself and then walked out of the door with her puppy trailing behind her. She returned in less than half an hour. Her basket was full of eggs and a large piece of cheese and meat. The light of the morning had increased and they could see her more. Nick stood up and dusted off his borrowed pants. He was putting wood in the fireplace to start the fire again. But after watching Serena for a few seconds, he walked toward her. "Please let me help," he said when he was behind her. Jumping startled, she gasped and whipped around toward him with a hand on her heart. Raising his hands a bit, Nick took a small step back, but Cal didn't help the small smile that covered his lips. Sorry, didn't want to scare you. Oh, it's okay. She smiled slightly back while rubbing her hands on the white apron she had wrapped around her waist. Her scratchy voice was barely above a whisper. It hurt her to talk louder. How can I help you? She had never seen the gamma of the pack or the young boy who was with them before, so despite the remaining three, she didn't have any bad feelings about them. It seems you are making breakfast, answered Nick while scratching the back of his neck. I wanted to see if I can help. Oh, it's not necessary. Serena smiled softly. You are my guest. I can do it myself. I insist. Nick smiled wider and then took a step closer to her, making her crane her neck even more to look into his eyes. He couldn't help his urges. As the gamma of the pack, he was the main person to protect the Luna of the pack, hence why he felt so drawn to be near her and help her by instinct. Step back. Unfurls through their mind link, the warning not missing from his tone. The feeling of possessiveness was back and he didn't like how Nick was standing so close to his mate. Nick stiffened for a second before stepping back and clearing his throat awkwardly, smiling a bit forced this time. You are already tired after taking care of Bait all night. He reasoned more. Serena glared excess way for a second, knowing about the mind link because of Nick's eyes that glossed over for a few seconds. His dark brown eyes clashed with hers, not showing any emotion before she looked at Nick again. She knew the man's sudden action must have been because of something that Ajax must have said through their mind link. You would help me greatly if you could peel some potatoes. Pointing to the sack of potatoes she had put near the table. I want to make some stew. You all must be so hungry. Nodding, they both fell into work. They put the meat and potatoes with onion and carrots in the pot she had placed on the stove before. They also made 2 loaves of bread that Nick put in the oven when Serena was called by Damien to help with one of Grayson's seizures. By 6 in the morning, she once again walked out of her room, just as Toby sat on the couch, rubbing his eyes with his fists and yawning. He then began to sniff the air and his head whipped toward the kitchen where Nick and Serena were setting the table. Do we have breakfast? His eyes widened, and he quickly scrambled to his feet before running to the kitchen, rubbing his hands and licking his lips. Chuckled Serena. Yes, she smiled at the boy who couldn't be more than 19. Have a seat. Toby complied immediately, making Serena chuckle again while pouring the mouth-watering stew into his bowl. Ruffling his hair with a fond smile on her lips, she went on to pour stew in other bowls as well, unaware of the 3 other men's gaze that were fixed on her. She really looked like a beautiful angel, radiating good vibes and peace. It was in that moment, while looking at her, mesmerized by her angelic behavior and looks, that Ajax asked himself why he had rejected her in the first place. He hadn't given her any chance. Sure, she didn't look too good that time. She was a scrawny little teenage girl with hollowed cheeks and dark bags under her eyes all the time. She was a skin and bone girl wearing tattered clothes all the time, though she was always clean before Grayson would decide to torment her physically as well as mentally by pushing her down to the muddy ground. But now she was a beautiful lady, gorgeous and delicate. Her body had filled in with flesh and slight curves that had given her a feminine figure. She even had become taller. She looked so proper and graceful in her movements and antics as well, like how a true Luna in fact should be, and he had rejected her before giving her a chance. Before giving himself the chance to enjoy having his mate. Such a chance that losing it had left a bitter emptiness in his chest. Help yourself. Her voice, which sounded melodic despite her neck injury, was what brought him out of his thought. Her eyes were dancing between the 3 men. Nick and Damien soon joined Toby, who was eating like a pig, and Ajax slowly joined them. You won't eat yourself? He asked before sitting down. She glanced at him for a second, before looking away and picking a bowl filled with steno. She answered him. I should prepare a meal for your beta. I can do it. Damien quickly stood up, but she raised a hand and stopped him. No, I'm not that hungry. I will do it. She smiled at him. You can then help me to feed your brother. Goddess, this is so delicious. cried Toby with his mouth still full, his bowl empty. Serena giggled, already liking the young werewolf a lot. Her smile instantly warmed up the kitchen again. There is more. Eat as much as you want, she said to him before walking to a cabinet and began to mash everything in the bowl with a masher. Nick and Damien chuckled and shook their heads when Toby almost flew up and served himself once again happily. But Ojak scowled and helped, glaring at Toby. He was feeling extremely jealous that Toby was the receiving end of his mate's smiles and giggles. He was even jealous of Nick as well. She was friendlier to him too. Although she wouldn't look at him and Darmine with hatred, he knew she wasn't fond of them at all. When she was done mashing stew, she walked toward her room. Will you help me feed your brother? Looking at Damien. He needs this more than us. To my agent extraordinaire, Moonlit, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You have to eat too. Enthusiasm, Ajax quickly butted in as Damien stood up. Her eyes snapped to him and she stared at him for a moment before nodding. I will, she answered finally before walking away. They walked out of her room after some time. He looks better, spoke Damien, walking out of the room after Serena. Serena turned to him and nodded with a slight smile. Indeed, she agreed. He is better, but we should still be so cautious. We should not leave his side for long. Damien nodded before frowning. His eyes got filled with guilt and remorse as he took a step towards Serena, who watched him a bit apprehensive. I'm so sorry, said Damien lowly while lightly touching the bruise on her neck with the tips of his fingers. I lost it last night and hurt you. You just act upon a habit of your friends and pack, she thought before forcing a smile and taking a step back. She opened her mouth to talk but stopped abruptly when she hit a wall behind her. Frowning, she whirled around only to come face to chest with Ajax. Without saying a word, he kept her in her place with one hand on her upper arm. And with the other, he gently tilted her head to her side to examine her neck. I'm okay. Please let me go, she protested and tried to free her arm from his grip, not wanting to be close to him at all. She watched as his face twisted with anger and his eyes narrowed on the bruise as if he expected it to vanish any second. You should have healed by now, he grunted, meeting her eyes that were now angry. I told you, I have no wolf anymore, she snapped angrily, finally prying her arm free and taking a step back from both of them. But Ajax didn't have any of those. His anger rose again quickly, his fists clenched and his jaw ticked. What has happened to your wolf? I saw her that day. He spoke through gritted teeth. And how could he not? The image of the small grey wolf that was running out of the town away from him was still etched in his mind and was the cause of lots of his nightmares. It's none of your business, she told him coldly, before gazing at Damien. And I'm not angry with you. You were worried for your brother and it looked like I was going to hurt him more. There is no hard feeling. She went to turn on her heel and leave, but a sudden roar of anger from Ajax stopped her right away. What the fuck is that? Just as she heard Ajax, her arm was once again snatched by him in a tight grip and she was yanked back to him, colliding to his chest with a nymph. Ajax bent his head and his now blazing silver eyes narrowed on the junction between her neck and shoulder, and he quickly pulled the collar of her dress down with his free hand. He looked into her shocked fright and green eyes. Is this a fucking mark? He forced the words out, his body shaking with both raw anger and his effort to keep his wolf in control who wanted to come out to destroy every's path. Who has dared to mark you? The fucker who you are living with. To my agent extraordinaire, Moonlit, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Her frightened eyes turned furious as he went on and she quickly pushed him away from her and freed herself. How dare you? Her delicate body beginning to shake with hot rage. You have no freaking right to demand answers from me. Staring intently into his silver eyes, her rage equivalent to his blazed in her own eyes. You lost your every right the moment you rejected me, banished me, and left me for wild rouges. She spat with heat. It wasn't important for you if I would die. So why are you demanding such answers from me now? Why have I become so important to you suddenly? Why is it important for you if I'm marked by another or not? Answer me or I swear to go on a hunt for the fucker you live with and kill him on the spot," growled Ajax so menacingly and coldly. His muscles were shaking. His claws were out as his wolf pushed him for a shift. "No you won't," she fired back, seething in anger. "You won't touch him or I swear to kill you with my bare hands." The threat was evident in her voice like a day, and they knew she would do just as she said. The other three just watched the couple warily who was staring down at each other angrily. "To my agent extraordinaire, Moonlit, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "Control yourself," Damien warned as he took a step forward in his beta mood, ready to control his alpha if necessary. Nick also took a step forward and stood protectively behind his Luna, closing her eyes. She took a deep shaky breath, trying to control her burning anger. Opening her eyes, they were emotionless and so cold that Ajax's wolf retreated momentarily and whimpered. "Not that it's any of your business." "But I'm not marked. It's just an old car. So calm down. To my agent extraordinaire, Moonlit, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." She spat the last word with hatred and then let out a bitter laugh before shaking her head. "You don't even know my name. You didn't even bother to get to know me before rejecting me." She turned back to go to the kitchen, sad and disappointed, but not as much as she expected herself to be. And that made her happy that he didn't have that much effect on her. She was just plain angry. At hearing her words, Ajax's body relaxed visibly and he squeezed his eyes shut tightly, trying to calm down. "What is your name then?" Serena halted and looked at Toby, who had asked the question. He was rubbing his hands together anxiously and his eyes were so sad that made her own heart clench. "Serena," she answered, smiling sadly. Ajax felt his insides melt and his anger vanishing for a second at hearing her name. Her name suited her greatly. Toby returned her smile and took a small step toward her. "I'm Toby. I'm a new warrior of the pack. Glad to meet you." "Glad to meet you too, dear Toby," she replied, her smile widening a bit. She then turned her head toward Nick. "I don't know your name as well," puffing his chest with pride. Mick took a step toward her as well with his head held high. "I'm Nick, the gamma of the pack." "Luna." Serena's smile faded instantly and she looked away. "Please don't call me that. I'm no Luna," she said and turned her back to everyone. "It's nice to meet you too." She didn't turn her head. Her anger was still present, and her heart was once again aching. She needed to calm herself down and avoid any conflicts with the men for her own sake. She had to survive on the remaining of her potion until James' return. Taking a deep breath, she turned to the men once again, needing to make things clear between them. "You are welcome to stay here until Beta Grayson heals," she said firmly, eyeing the four of them. "Then I want you to leave. I'm nothing to you other than a stranger healer and my life is my own. Please don't overstep your welcome." Her eyes snapped to Ajax once again, challenging. They stared into each other's eyes, green meeting silver before Ajax looked away and stormed out of the cottage, slamming the door shut behind him. After a moment, they heard the cracking of bones, and then a black wolf dashed inside there for the snowy forest.